On the best. Too short of the torso, so the chair is short.
Hi everyone, good evening. It's a beautiful spring day. We got lucky today. Thank you everyone for coming. My name is Zara Amanpour. I've been on the board of the Women's Freedom Forum since 2004. So 21 years I've been part of this wonderful organization. And I have the honor of moderating this panel, these wonderful women tonight. So thank you for being here. Thank you for making the time for this very important topic. I hope that you've been enjoying the event. We're at the end of the CSW events now. I hope you've been enjoying it and really taking advantage of this incredible opportunity. Happy Women's History Month to all of you. It's such a joy to be able to celebrate this month every year in this forum and with all of you. And happy Ramadan to those who celebrate. I'm also celebrating, so happy Ramadan to anyone in the room who is celebrating. And thank you to everyone who is joining us from around the world. We are live streaming this on YouTube, so please, you can text your people to tune in and join us on YouTube Live. And you can also please follow us and share our posts on X at that handle there that you see there. Okay. Today we have some handouts. If you weren't able to grab one on your way in, it's about the panel, all the panel and the speakers. You can also scan this barcode. It has contact information if there's anybody you want to follow up with after the event. You can grab one of those handouts or just scan this QR code to get our contact information and to learn more about the panel today. We have these wonderful, beautiful bags, which I'm really excited that we have. Women, Resistance, and Freedom, which is the slogan that is being chanted in the streets of Tehran these days by many women. So we have them in the back of the room. We're selling them for $20 if anyone is interested in purchasing one. We'd love to give them to you. Okay? So before I introduce you to this incredible panel today, and Ida keeps telling me I have to be louder, so even though you're in front of me, I'm going to be very loud, but it might be a little awkward. But before I introduce you to this wonderful panel, I would like to tell you a little bit more about Women's Freedom Forum and why we are here today. Women an educational NGO with a mission to raise public awareness on women's issues, including human rights, empowerment, economic development, and gender equality. WFF holds consultative status with UN ECOSOC and is in association with the UN Department of Global Communication. Our research focuses on issues in countries where women experience strong social challenges towards their rights. Our long-term vision is to live in a world where there is equality, social justice, and respect for women's rights. WFF's publications and presentations are referenced for inclusion in international reports by UN missions, universities, NGOs, and individuals. We share the issues and speak for those who cannot rightly speak for themselves. We provide platforms to share relevant information. The speakers are experts in their own chosen mission. The positions or opinions of speakers and writers may not necessarily be those of Women's Freedom Forum. However, we support the independent right of our speakers to share their experiences and express their views. As all of you are aware, this year marks 30 years since the 1995 Beijing Women's Conference and the creation of the Beijing Platform for Action, which set the stage and served as a catalyst for so much of the work and exchanges that have happened inside and outside of the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women since then. It was also a catalyst for Women's Freedom Forum. There we are. Here you can see a photo of several of our members at the 1995 Beijing Women's Conference. Women's Freedom Forum worked for nearly 2 years to secure participation in the conference, and ultimately we attended for several weeks. A key issue we advanced was the impact of Islamic extremism on women. This ideology poses a direct and severe threat to women, who are its primary victims. Gender discrimination and misogyny form the foundation of extremist thought, where everything from the concept of piety and chastity to laws on sin and punishment is rooted in oppression against women. Women are perceived as second-class citizens deprived of fundamental freedom. For example, in legal systems, the testimony of 2 women is equal to that of 1 man. Women are forced to adhere to mandatory dress codes, and they are prohibited from traveling alone. Since extremism is built upon gender discrimination, women must take an active and leading role in confronting it. The only path to defeating it is through women's organized participation in a movement based on the principles of gender equality and respect for women's rights. For the past 30 years, Women's Freedom Forum has participated in the CSW and strived to bring the stories and voices of women from around the world, particularly in the MENA region and Iran, to the rest of the world. We have been a platform for many women's issues, but none have been more at the forefront for us than violence against women. Time and time again, our journeys have led us to the horrific and plaguing claws of violence and its merciless grip on women. It is a tool for all forms of extremism, which has penetrated all faiths, ideologies, and hemispheres. Next slide. Here's another photo of that event. A lot of my aunties were there. Here is the document that we put forward with a group of other organizations. One of the most pressing issues discussed in the 1995 Beijing conference was violence against women. Harrowing reports were presented exposing the extent of abuse and injustice faced by women worldwide. These revelations urged the global women's movement to prioritize the issue, leading to numerous exhibitions, forums, and academic discussions in universities, research institutions, and even the US Congress. Over the years, extensive books have been published documenting the unheard and unreported stories of violence against women in the Middle East, particularly in Iran. Women's Freedom Forum played a significant role in highlighting these atrocities, delivering speeches and events on topics such as the stoning of women in Iran, the struggles of young girls, and the repression and systematic pressure that fundamentalism imposes on women. You can see here we have photos of 3 generations, the last 30 years of women who have been victims of violence and have died for freedom in Iran. Go to the next slide, please. Today, actually during the day when we met some of you there, we had an exhibit right here in front of the United Nations showing their beautiful faces and many others. These are all women who have fallen for freedom in Iran in the last 3 decades. Unfortunately, despite all of these efforts, violence against women has not diminished over the last 30 years. It has evolved, found new forms, and found new avenues to spread through. Similar to a virus, it mutates and adapts. According to the World Health Organization, approximately 30% of women globally have experienced physical and or sexual violence by an intimate partner or non-partner sexual violence in their lifetime. UNICEF recently reported that 1 in 8 girls and women are raped or sexually assaulted before age 18. The number rises to 1 in 5 when non-contact forms of sexual violence, such as online or verbal abuse, are taken into account. My home country, Iran, has the highest number of executions of women in the world. The enforcement of compulsory hijab, which is an official policy of the Iranian regime and receives an annual budget exceeding that of schools and hospitals, is the most pervasive form of violence inflicted on Iranian women. This includes the daily brutal arrests of thousands of women on the streets, beatings in detention centers, forced confessions and written pledges, fines, flogging, and even execution for failing to comply with the compulsory hijab laws. The reality is that systematic violence against women is not a social or political issue. It is an ideological and cultural crisis. Laws enforced by fundamentalist regimes institutionalize discrimination and gender-based oppression, leaving women without legal protection against violence and injustice. Countless women have suffered from forced child marriages, honor killings, domestic violence, and severe legal restrictions that deny them their basic human rights. Sadly, there is currently a powerful global backlash to women's rights, led by extremists and the governments that they back. These oppressive measures seek to silence women, weaken their role in society, and strip them of their agency. I know many of you are in the trenches combating these measures every day. The pendulum is swinging in the wrong direction, and humanity is in a defining moment around gender equality. It begs the question, what world will we have to offer our daughters and granddaughters? While these statistics and circumstances are dark and dire, as a global movement, we must also acknowledge the progress that has been made since the Beijing Conference services to support victims. We also have more comprehensive, according to a recent UN report released earlier this month, approximately 88% of countries have enacted laws to combat violence against women and have established services to support victims. We also have a more comprehensive and accurate assessment of the status of women than ever before, thanks to enhanced data collection. This empowers us to be more strategic. My friend Lynn will share how data can empower our work in her talk today. Women in fundamentalist controlled societies have shown extraordinary resilience. They have led protests, organized underground education programs, and risked their lives to fight for justice. You will meet one of these women, my friend Mitra, tonight. The amazing participation and momentum around the CSW this year is another testament to the progress that is being made. This room is just one reflection of that movement. While governments may be taking steps backwards, the grassroots movement for women's equality is strong and vibrant. The global women's movement must continue to amplify the voices of women from all corners of the world, advocate for policy changes, and ensure the protection of women's rights worldwide. The fight against fundamentalism is not just a women's issue. It is a human rights issue that impacts the stability and progress of our entire society. As history has shown, when women rise, societies progress. The path forward requires collective action, unwavering commitment, and international solidarity to dismantle the structures of gender-based oppression and create a world where every woman is free to live with dignity, equality, and justice. Today's panel will focus on providing a 30-year assessment on violence against women. Each of these women has a unique perspective to share. Our hope is that today's conversation will give us more data, more stories, and more hope, and contribute to our incredible movement against the statistics powers that be. So now, let's turn to our panel. We kindly ask that you save your questions to the end. So, with that, Lynn, are you ready?
Yeah.
I'd like to introduce our first panel member, Lynn Dykstra. Lynn Dykstra is the founder of Pride for Freedom, is a passionate human rights advocate and international events photographer and story writer. OGCF documents the courageous stories of those fighting for basic human rights in authoritarian regimes. Lynn serves as a Women's Freedom Forum representative for the United Nations, issues relating to SDG number 5, gender equality. She gave us our pins that we're all wearing today. And the elimination of violence against women and girls, and currently serves as the Advocacy Chair for the United Nations Association USA Davis Chapter, California. Thank you.
Sit this down so I can see you. Good evening. Look at all of you here at 6:30 at night. Fantastic. Thank you all for being with us this evening. And we honor and thank the United Nations and UN Women and the CSW staff and the volunteers for bringing us all together at this very, very challenging yet empowering time. I'm proud to represent Women's Freedom Forum on the United Nations issues and want to point out that WFF is celebrating, as Zara said, our 30 years, as this was created at the same time as the Beijing Conference in 1995.
You guys shout.
I have to, okay. I also have the privilege as serving as the advocacy chair for the Davis, California chapter of UN Association USA, where we share a global perspective with our strong and growing community-based membership. And with Global Cry for Freedom, with the Global Cry for Freedom Project, it is a privilege to share the stories of women and men from Iran who were able, through much support and many graces, to leave their authoritarian country after suffering extreme torture at the hands of government regimes. And with tremendous mental and emotional strength and courage, they continue to work to free those who were left behind. Those of you here today who were dedicated to women's rights 30 years ago have witnessed 3 decades of gender equality progress, and yes, setbacks. In communities around the world, you've saved lives and you've empowered women. So thank you, big thank you. Today we stand at a crossroads again, and with the challenge of meeting the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, yet we are not new to this. With our experience and our commitment, we know that once again the pendulum will swing toward achieving equality, one woman at a time. We move forward with the same dedication and strength we've always had. How many of you, just by a show of hands, how many of you were working in eliminating the violence and abuse against women 30 years ago? Those of you.
The oldest in the room. No, that's not true.
Well, now, those of us, we may face an undeniable truth. We can't avoid it. We're 30 years older. And yes, we're wiser too. Many of us are now in or approaching our 60s and beyond, and I refer to this age group as older, only because the UN World Health Organization recent older people study officially defined older as those over 60. Now, you can choose your own older level. Between now and 2030, the number of people aged 60 and over is expected to increase by 31%. 31. This means that those of us who have spent our adult lives advocating for young women and children must now turn our attention to the growing number of older women in our communities worldwide. Discrimination, prejudice, and abuse know no age boundary. Let me share just a few examples, and you've heard stories like the one I'm about to tell over and over again. In a Middle Eastern country, a well-respected school teacher married her husband, but soon after, domestic violence toward her began. Verbal abuse, gaslighting, physical beatings followed. She was too afraid to report him and too afraid to leave. She needed her job, as it also gave her a way to leave the home. Over time, she grew used to the abuse and started believing she deserved it. Eventually, she accepted this as her life. She lost her confidence as she grew old with her husband. She justified the beatings by claiming, he is a good man overall. Defeatism is a heavy, heavy burden to carry through life. In the 1980s, a beautiful young woman in Iran was illegally arrested at home and taken prisoner as a proxy for her brother, who had participated in a peaceful street protest. When the police broke into her home, her brother wasn't there. So what did they do? They kidnapped her instead and dragged her to prison. They didn't want to go back to the station empty-handed. The trauma she experienced in prison, from the thick blood on the floors to the screams of her cellmates, has haunted her ever since. Now in her 70s and disabled by a stroke, she still carries the weight of those memories. In this fortunate outcome, and the opposite of the story above, in her older years, her extremely supportive husband and family continue to embrace a sense of peace and expansive love for her in a home far away from her native country. I count her as family too. Even in the United States, in one of the largest and most peaceful cities, older Asian women are now afraid to leave their homes. They face verbal, physical, and violent attacks on public streets, even in broad daylight. According to Asian American Foundation, nearly 1 in 3 Asian, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders feel unsafe in public, either to having been a victim of an attack or knowing someone who was attacked. One example is an Asian professional accountant who refuses to leave her home alone to meet with her clients for fear of being assaulted. Financial abuse is another growing threat to women over 60 worldwide, whether in banking, real estate, or healthcare. In parts of Africa, widows who have worked land alongside their husbands for years often lose their rights to it upon his death. Instead, male relatives take control of the land, leaving the widow potentially destitute, both psychologically and economically. Until recently, there's been very little research on the trauma, abuse, and gender discrimination faced by older women around the world. But now, this is changing. According to Our World data, at least 1 in 6 older people experience verbal, psychological, or domestic abuse worldwide. Economic detachment, which leads to homelessness, hunger, and generational trauma, is prevalent. The Intervention Accelerator and the UN World Health Organization are now working to address the abuse of older people. Their recent reports note that few meaningful interventions currently exist to support older people facing discrimination. However, they have identified 89 promising interventions aimed at improving knowledge of abuse, raising awareness, and reducing mental health symptoms. Ultimately, their goal, as is all of ours, is to prevent abuse in this demographic altogether. Lastly, I want to highlight Amnesty International's Age Loud campaign, which seeks to protect the human rights of older people. They aim to change global attitudes toward age-related discrimination, poverty, and neglect. Amnesty International applauds the United Nations member states' decision to address gaps in this protection of human rights, recommending the creation of a new international convention to tackle these overlooked issues. Work is beginning and positive results are on the horizon as long as we as individuals and with our NGOs continue to raise awareness of the challenges faced by older persons and take action within our community to support them. We may have missed the opportunity to support them early in their younger years, now, women, helping vulnerable adults, for the rights of older people, wherever the need is in the world. The challenges have never been greater, never. To each of you, your commitment and your kindness in support of others to rise up and succeed is extraordinary. And all of us at Women's Freedom Forum honor you for this mission. Thank you.
So it's a question from Barry.
What's that?
It's a question from Barry.
Yes, please. Thank you, Lynn. Such an interesting talk. And as I said, we have information now, we have data now. And this is a very powerful thing to have for this work, something that hasn't been available and certainly not easy to get our hands on. So thank you for that. It's a very powerful talk. Next, I'm going to introduce Dr. Antonia Felix. She is a New York Times bestselling author of 25 books, including biographies of women leaders such as Elizabeth Warren, Sonia Sotomayor, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and Condoleezza Rice. She is an assistant in the Department of Educational Leadership at Minnesota State University, Mankato, where her research is gender equity in public education, teaching, and leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Zara. Well, we're looking back the last 30 years. I'm gonna go back to just 25 years ago and show you some of the main movements that have been going on in Iran, starting in '99. I'm not gonna read all of that, but you can skim through it. These are major uprisings. There have been many, many others, but these are major uprisings. And tonight, I'm just going to talk with a little bit of detail about the last two, because women are very involved in these as well. And this is something that is ongoing at the moment, so it's very timely. On September 16th, 2022, Mahsa Amini died while in custody of Iran's morality police. She had been arrested for not properly wearing her hijab as mandated by law. The public outcry over Amini's death ignited the largest protests in Iran since the 1979 revolution. The tragedy mobilized Iranian women across the country to not only protest the mandatory hijab, but to reject the government itself. This marked the beginning of the Woman Life Freedom Movement. We have a little variation on that on our bag, but you get the idea. In 2023, a year into that movement, Iran's parliament ramped up the penalties for violating the women's dress code from a maximum of 2 months and some fines to a maximum of 15 years in prison. But the massive size of the Woman Life Freedom Movement made such an impression on leaders that they paused bringing that revision in the law forward. Maybe they thought that a severe move like the new sentencing would ignite yet another surge of mass protests in the streets, or maybe they just run out of ammunition. Security forces had killed 551 protesters, including 49 women and 68 children in that year. Most had been shot or beaten to death with batons. Even under the threat of 15 years in a prison system known for its brutality against women, including beatings, lashings, and rape, women in Iran continue to protest the Islamic regime by going in public without the hijab and cutting their hair. The movement changed people. It gave women even more courage and awakened men to the injustices suffered by Iranian women. In response, the government has turned to digital technology to enforce the compulsory hijab. Women are now under surveillance through drones, facial recognition cameras, and an app that citizens and police can use to instantly report violations of the hijab to the authorities. The latest protest movement, which is coinciding with the No Executions campaign, began in January of just last year in response to years of escalating amounts of executions in Iran, as Zara had noted. Next one, please. Among the hundreds executed in 2024 were at least 31 women convicted of various charges, the highest number since this data began to be tracked 17 years ago. From 2010 to 2024, at least 241 women have been executed. Next slide, please. In January 24, a group of political prisoners in a Ghazel Hazar prison in Karaj, Iran's largest state prison, went on a hunger strike to protest the latest wave of group executions in their prison. We can turn to the next one too. The hunger strike was designed to be the first in a weekly Tuesday protest that became known as Black Tuesdays or No Death Tuesdays, named for the day of the week that prisoners headed for the gallows were transferred to solitary confinement. In the following weeks and months, the hunger strike campaign spread to prisons across the country. Today, this week is the 60th week of those protests, now known as No Executions. The latest count of prisons that this has moved to is 38 across the country. We're on. These protesters include inmates in the women's ward in Tehran's Evin prison and activists protesting outside the prison and other prisons. Last month, a group of civil rights activists gathered outside Evin prison chanting, "Woman, life, freedom," and "No to executions." Among them was Narges Mohammadi, the human rights activist who was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2023 while serving one of her sentences in Evin prison. Here, she's in the center burning a noose as a symbolic gesture about no executions. In most cases, political and social activists' incarceration is illegal in terms of the lack of due process when they're arrested. As an Iran researcher at Human Rights Watch stated about the sham process, defendants are systematically deprived of access to lawyers of their own choice during the trial and are subjected to torture and coerced confessions and then rushed to the gallows. Next, please. In her book, White Torture, Narges Mohammadi gives voice to women political prisoners about their experiences in solitary confinement. The title refers to Iran's unique form of incarceration, a psychological technique that keeps prisoners isolated for prolonged, indefinite periods of time in a cell where everything is completely white. One woman interviewed in this book, a Sufi, was arrested with about 100 fellow dervishes for gathering together in Iran one night in 2018. Bloody from the beatings by security forces, she was sent to solitary confinement in a women's prison near Tehran. In excruciating pain and bleeding from a blow to her head, she was crammed into a 2-yard by 2-yard cell with 2 other women. The 3 were confined to the tiny cell for 10 days before being taken out for some fresh air. After a brief trip to the hospital to tend to her head injury, she was taken to her own cell. From there, she could hear the zapping of electrical shocks being given to dervishes in the hallway. When she joined others in a sit-in to protest not being allowed to make calls after months in solitary confinement, they were attacked by the guards. The agents struck our heads and faces directly with an electric cattle prod, she said. I had been electrocuted so much that I became completely numb. They shocked me from head to toe. Our clothes were all torn and we were also severely beaten. That was why we decided to go on a hunger strike. Another woman described her experience in Kerman prison, where 420 women prisoners were held when she was arrested and sent there in 2016. She was immediately sent to solitary confinement in a 2-yard by 1-yard cell. The room had a blanket on the floor, a fan built into a small window that blocked the light, and a powerful light bulb in the center that never went out. She described the agony of her first week when sheer terror kept her awake 24 hours a day. My heart palpitated so hard that when I put my head on the blanket, it felt like it would explode. I prayed when I heard the call to prayer and realized that it was morning. Then morning would slither to noon, and noon to night. I couldn't sleep at night, and by the sound of sparrows, I knew it was dawn. The resistance of Iran's women that began after the Islamic Revolution in 1979 has been a constant in the country's history. In 2025, the stakes remain as high as they get. Iranian women lead the fight for a democratic future in the country. Some fight with the courage to hunger strike in a stifling, filthy, tiny cell. Others dare to post pictures of themselves with hair flying free in a moment of public protest. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonia. As always, you have touched our hearts and taught us something about what has been happening in the world with women, but today's story was about Iran, what has been happening there. As Iranian, thank you. Grateful for that. Next, I'd like to introduce Mitra Samani, my friend, former political prisoner in Iran, survivor turned activist in support of women and human rights. She was arrested by the Iranian security forces for being a women's rights activist. During her 4-year imprisonment, she endured and witnessed brutal tortures and summary executions of tens of activist women. After her release from prison, Mitra was under constant surveillance, and for several years, she had to go to Evin prison for monthly interrogation. Finally, after a long and painful process, she managed to get out of the country and settle in the United States. Thank you for being here.
Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you for the introduction. I was 15 when Iran's revolution took place in 1979. On September 7, 1981, at 5 p.m., I was abducted for distributing flyers in support of women's rights. I was imprisoned for 4 harrowing years in Tehran's notorious Evin prison. From the moment I arrived, I was overwhelmed by fear and shock at the brutality I witnessed. Torture began immediately. The air was filled with ceaseless sounds of screams and flogging. Mothers with newborn infants, grandmothers in their 70s, pregnant women, and teenagers surrounded me in prison. I am forever grateful to the brave mothers and women who helped me to retain my sanity. The guidance and their maternity-loving support saved me at the time. Iran's fundamentalist regime could not rule without genocide. Around the country, thousands were rounded up and put in prison. Most were high schoolers and university students. hundreds were executed each night inside prisons. I still can hear the sound of the grass every night. We could count often up to 200 each night, and that continued for several months. In the summer of 1988, thousands of young political prisoners, men and women, started to disappear. Prisons across the country were put on lockdown, and the authorities suspended family visits. Gradually, terrifying rumors began to circulate about mass secret executions and the dumping of bodies in unmarked mass graves. Families' worst fears were confirmed in late October of 1988 when prison visits resumed and authorities informed many families that their loved ones have been executed. However, over the last 37 years, the authorities have cruelly denied them not only a body to mourn over, but also the truth about when, how, and why their loved ones were killed. What happened to them in their last moments, and where their remains are buried. An example of a family without multiple victims is Mariam Akbari Mumfared's family. Mariam, a mother of 3 daughters, was arrested in 2009, accused of enmity against God. Translation: seeking justice for the killing of her 4 siblings, 3 brothers and a sister, who were executed by the mullah's regime. Throughout her imprisonment, Mariam has endured relentless hardship. She has never been granted a single hour of furlough, not even for essential medical care, or to see her 3 daughters. Despite these inhumane conditions, she has remained a powerful voice for justice. In 2016, she took the extraordinary step of filing a formal complaint from inside prison, demanding an investigation into executions of her siblings. A year later, she exposed the regime's brutality in a letter to foreign ambassadors visiting Evin prison, revealing the true conditions hidden behind the authorities' facade. Her story is not just a testament of the regime's brutality, but also to the resilience of the human spirit. As she herself wrote, and I quote, "One day I will sing the song of victory from the mountaintop like the sun." And unquote. The reason I get so emotional, and I shouldn't be, I'm so sorry about that, is that her mother was in prison with us, and at the visitation times every month, or after that every 2 weeks, she was running around. So the grandparents brought her to see her mother, and now she has been in prison for 17 years now. Mariam's continued imprisonment is not just an attack on her, it is an attack on all who dare to seek justice in Iran. Yet, as she remains behind bars, she is proving that the regime has failed to silence her for the last 5,500 plus days and counting. Amidst Iranian people's increasing dissent, we are witnessing an incredible growth in women's participation and leadership that is very inspiring. Case in point is the women prisoners with their weekly hunger strike, as Antonia was mentioning, on Tuesdays. demanding an end to regime's executions. It is called No to Execution Tuesdays, and as she mentioned, today was the 60th week of it, and it's happening in 38 prisons all around Iran. They too have become another source of inspiration to the people of Iran, especially to women and girls. Hence, we are witnessing a major uptake in women's protesting to bring about an end to a tyrannical regime. Iranian women have learned when their bright future lies, it's through leadership, resisting the Islamic fundamentalist regime and the brutal suppressive entities inside Iran and around the globe. The famous slogan the world has come to know now is woman, resistance, freedom, as we hear it from women's prison words echoing all around Iran. Women are the force for change. Thank you.
Mitra, there's no words for your courage. Thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce Rezvan Alafchi. She is an Iranian-American mother of three living in New York who has dedicated her life to both her professional work and the fight for justice. With over 2 decades of experience in bookkeeping and office management, she has built a career rooted in precision, organization, and responsibility. Beyond her work, Rezvan has been a lifelong advocate for human rights, deeply involved in the Iranian resistance movement. She believes in standing up against oppression, amplifying women's voices, and creating a future where justice and equality prevail. Balancing career, motherhood, and activism, she is committed to making an impact both in her community and on a larger global scale. Rezvan, thank you for being here.
Good evening, everyone. I stand before you today as a woman, a mother, an Iranian, and an American. Each of these identities carries meaning, history, and responsibility. Each of them in its own way comes with struggles, and together they form a reality that many women like me live every single day. A reality of balancing, of justifying, of pushing forward despite the resistance that meets us at every turn. Let's start with work. As women, especially as women of color, immigrant women, and Iranian women, we fight for a place at the table. We work harder, speak softer, and smile through microaggressions just to be accepted. And for what? For a paycheck that doesn't match our male counterparts? For an assumption that we're either too submissive or too aggressive? And for those of us with names that are foreign to some, let's be honest, it often feels like we have to prove we belong in professional spaces at all. Then there's motherhood, the expectation to be the perfect mother, the ever-present nurturer, the patient teacher, the unshakable support system. But at the same time, we're pressured to act as if motherhood is just a side job, one that shouldn't interfere with our careers. The hypocrisy is exhausting. We are told to lean in, but no one leans in to help us. And then there's heritage, my Iranian identity, my history, my culture. Yet for many, my heritage is seen as an obstacle rather than a source of strength. I carry the weight of stereotypes, assumptions that I am oppressed, that my culture is backwards, that my identity as an Iranian American is something to be questioned rather than understood. But how has really changed in the past 30 years? There was a time when women were told their place was in the home, and for many, that expectation has not disappeared. Yes, we have made strides. Women are now heads of companies, leading movements, and breaking barriers. But in many ways, our battles remain the same. The fight for equal pay, for reproductive rights, for freedom of choice, for the right to exist without fear, these struggles are still ongoing. In some places, there have been regression in Iran. For example, women once walked the streets without the fear of morality police enforcing what they wore. Now, young women risk their lives just to push back against that control. In the Middle East, in North Africa, and developing nations across the world, women's struggles are magnified. They face not just gender oppression, but political oppression, economic disparity, and war. They carry burdens we can barely comprehend, yet their resilience remains unmatched. But oppression doesn't always come in the form of physical violence. The unrealistic expectations, the microaggressions, the glass ceilings, these too are forms of systematic violence. They may not leave bruises, but they break confidence, limit opportunities, and reinforce a hierarchy that keeps women in their place. This is a mental violence, a form of repression that seeps into our daily lives, making us doubt ourselves, making us feel small, making us believe, if only for a moment, that maybe we are asking for too much, but we are not. The pressures on us come at different levels, subtle in some places, violent in others, but they all stem from the same root, a world that still sees women as less capable, less valuable, less deserving of choice. And while some of us have the privilege of speaking up, of fighting back in boardrooms, in courtrooms, and in classrooms, we must remember those who are silenced before they even have the chance. So what do? We stand together, we listen, we amplify, and we act, whether through policy, through protest, or simply through telling our stories. Our fight is connected. When we demand equal pay, we set an example for women fighting for economic freedom elsewhere. When we challenge discriminatory policies, we give courage to those who cannot safely do so. And when we raise our voices, we make it harder for the world to ignore the truth. Women across the world are carrying the weight of history, of culture, of expectation. But we are not just carrying it, we are reshaping it. And we will not stop until every woman, no matter where she is born, no matter her background, has the right to work, to learn, to lead, and to live freely. Today, I stand before you in solidarity with the women around the world who have sacrificed freedom and justice. I stand with the women of Iran who have resisted tyranny, risen in the streets, and made their voice be heard. I stand with Nika Shakrami and thousands of others who gave their lives so that we can all be heard, and for my daughters to have a better future. I join in their cry for women, resistance, freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Rizwan. We often forget in living in these societies that have so much privilege that these issues are closer to home. And especially in today's environment and what's happening, we are very close to home, very connected and related. If we're not careful, we will all be moving to the wrong side of the pendulum. Last, but certainly not least, I would like to introduce Liliana Bakhtiari. The first generation Iranian Azeri woman, American born, raised in Atlanta, Georgia. They are serving their first time as a member of the Atlanta representing the citizens of District 5. Professionally, Liliana has worked in affordable housing, women's and children's health, and environmental justice across 26 countries around the world. Since returning to the U.S., Liliana has served as the public affairs manager of Planned Parenthood Southeast, lobbied for voting rights with Pro-Georgia, served as a consultant for equal market research as they built out their social justice division, and collaborated with Partners for Home to establish a hotel program housing our at-risk unsheltered population during the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2021, they were elected to serve on the Atlanta City Council. In their tenure on City Council, they have authorized legislation providing access to legal counsel for individuals facing eviction, decriminalizing abortion in the wake of the Dobbs decision, and expanding housing voucher requirements for city-funded projects. Awards include 2021 Person of the Year from the Georgia Voice, 2022 Next Generation Leader of the Year Award from Out Georgia, and the 2023 David Bowie Fellowship, which afforded them the opportunity to attend the Harvard Kennedy School of Public Policy. Liliana is the first queer Muslim person to be elected in the state of Georgia, and the first non-binary person elected in the city of Atlanta.
Azad, you're gonna have to help me keep time.
Gotcha.
Given that politicians are rather waffly. So I'm Liliana Bakhtiari. It's an honor to join y'all today. It's an honor to be a part of this forum. These women are my heroes. Nietzsche is very much my hero. And I'm grateful to be a part of this because, as we know, global violence against women is an epidemic that has been happening for, I think, for many of us as long as we can remember. I have been lucky enough to hold elected office with my experiences as the child of Iranian American immigrants and refugees. I stand before you today as an elected official for Atlanta City Council. I will tell you it's not easy to hold this position in the American South as a non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid individual from a Muslim family, which in many ways, as you know about the South, is not embraced readily. But I'm also here to talk to you about the global work that I have done. I have been lucky enough to work in, as you heard Dara say, more than 26 countries around the globe. I started doing this work when I was about 20 years old, even though I started marching in the streets with my father when I was 8. Just combating the Iranian or protesting against the Iranian dictatorship for as long as I can remember. The work I have done globally has been very difficult, a blessing in many ways, but very hard. In Kenya, I was able to work with tribes where rape was not a concept that existed. A man had every right to take a woman at any time because women had no autonomy. Young girls had no autonomy, often being taken as young as 11 or 12 and impregnated.
You need to speak louder.
I also worked with women who were victims of female genital mutilation throughout the Dasanich tribe in northern Kenya. It was a practice that was perpetrated because oftentimes women were conditioned to believe that if they did not have female genital mutilation, that they would die from uncleanliness. I was, interestingly enough, there at a time of crossroads with Western influence and saw the repercussions of losing that touch to ancestral traditions, but also gaining more access to healthcare through Western Christian influence. And it was a very interesting crossroads in which women were further left behind. In Cambodia, I was there for the war tribunals, where people that perpetrated the acts of killing fields in the Khmer, I'm sorry guys, it's very emotional, the Khmer Rouge. And my job was to go into the countryside and interview individuals, especially women, on their experiences during the genocide, because everyone there is a victim of genocide. I saw women sold in front of me, trafficked young girls. Trafficking there begins as young as 5, 6 years old, because due to poverty, children, oftentimes young girls, are sent to the streets to do everything they can to create additional income for their families. And oftentimes, as a result, when they are offered jobs, they are taken to warehouses and trafficked, and their families never see them again. I spoke with young girls because of the lack of healthcare that was afforded throughout Southeast Asia, that had to sell their virginity oftentimes to provide healthcare for their families. Worked with women in India who were victims of men attacking them with acid. I think oftentimes we hold certain people in high esteem, such as people like Mahatma Gandhi, who actually was a raging misogynist and is also responsible for a large amount of the culture that takes place in India today, because he believed that if a woman was raped, that a family could conduct an honor killing and kill their daughter or kill their wife or kill any female in their family for bringing shame for being raped, because if they were, this idea was that it was the woman's fault. I have worked with so many women who have experienced that type of hatred and those attacks and threats on their life for undergoing sexual assault. I've worked and covered stories in the Congo, the rape capital of the world, where rape is often used as a weapon of torture and war. Burma, where I worked with women who were exiled and tortured in prison, let go only to see family only to be taken days later as a sign or as a method of psychological warfare. And of course, throughout South America, where bodily autonomy due to Western influences of Catholicism have taken away women's rights. I have seen in every single one of these communities that women are the cornerstone of everything, of healthy communities, healthy societies. There is not one place in the world that I have worked where the treatment and health of women is not directly correlated to the health of an economy and a community. Women are the cornerstone of everything. Their treatment is the cornerstone of everything. One of the first signs of a free fall into fascism or a dictatorship or a repressive regime is stripping away bodily autonomy and rights. When women are seen as nothing more than birthing machines, and taking away family education and access to reproductive health care ensures that women have no right over their bodies. I think a perfect example of this is what we saw in Italy when Mussolini took power, where women were forced to birth essentially patriots of the state, and where they were rewarded if they could birth 6 or more children, and had oftentimes those children taken away from them. I believe that this is the first time in my life that I feels like we are going backwards, even in this country. It's a scary time, and we see in Iran and many countries around the world where women are treated nothing more than livestock. In fact, I believe one of the first things the president said when he took over, and first things that this regime said, this dictatorship of Mullah said when they first came to power was, women are livestock to be used as men intend them to be used, and nothing more. I, even in my role on council, all of these women here in our roles and the work that we do, have achieved so much, but still experience micro, macro aggressions in our environments and the work that we do. I am constantly faced with xenophobia, prejudice, misogyny, and the work that I do on council, oftentimes in the work that we do in our communities, men especially, but individuals do not feel the urgency of these issues. It is a constant fight. For many of us, breathing is a form of protest. Existing is a form of protest. I do believe, however, and am heartened by the fact that in times of oppression, beautiful things are born. Hyperlocalism and building community are the keys to everything. The stories you've heard today from these individuals and the community they've built and welcomed me into has been one of the most life-changing and rewarding experiences I could ask for. The women I have worked with and those who have survived horrific things. Many of us, as you heard Mitra say, I don't think I'll ever forget the screams of the women I've seen beaten, forget the women that in Burma and Burmese refugee camps where the only thing we could do for them was give them sewing kits because at night slits were cut in the back of their tents and they were raped. And what we did was give them sewing kits so that they could sew their tent back together to avoid the shame, even though it was not their fault. There is a culture and a prejudice that we must constantly fight that women are not asking for. We're not asking for it. A woman has every right to do what she wants with her body, has every right to have access to reproductive health care, has every right to be educated on bodily autonomy. And everywhere I have traveled in the world, from the work I have done with journalism in Afghanistan, that's one way to cut off a speech.
Everybody attending the CSW, just a reminder that all meeting rooms should be cleared off at 8 o'clock. Thank you. Have a good night.
Look at a man trying to shut me down. Oppression.
We have plenty of time.
That was so rude, I lost my train of thought.
Bodily autonomy.
Thank you. And everywhere I've traveled, from the work I've done in the Middle East to the work I've done in Africa and South America, I have never seen a situation where a woman did not want to have access to reproductive health care. In parts of Africa, once we taught women, especially in areas like Uganda, that they could have access to birth control without their husbands finding out, without their families finding out, they jumped at the opportunity. They didn't know things like this existed. Working with Doctors Without Borders and finding out that they went to Afghanistan and other parts of the world where women in some of the most rural areas where they found out that they could have their tubes tied or have hysterectomies or have procedures done where they wouldn't have to have children. Doctors have shown up to these locations. One story in particular, a Doctors Without Borders was in a rural part of Afghanistan, extraordinarily impoverished, and came with the resources to do procedures on 200 women. 2,000 women showed up. And when they found out there weren't enough resources for them, they rioted because they were that desperate. To me, the biggest and most important work any of us can do is fighting for access to bodily autonomy and reproductive health care, because everything in our world is based on what women provide us. And I will say that as hard as this work is, I could not imagine myself doing anything else. Global crisis relief work, I think, is the most rewarding and impactful work a person can do, because it is a form of violence and a form of hate to make us feel separated from each other. It is a form of violence and a form of hate to keep many of us away from our Iranian roots. I have never been to my home country. I don't know if I will. I am sure I will my lifetime. Watching my family feel separated from their home and watching their perseverance to continue protesting for their rights and to continue protesting for my rights, because if I were to go to Iran today, it would not be safe for me as a queer individual and as someone who has spoken out against the dictatorship, especially coming from a family of individuals who have done the same. I have tremendous hope there, because in times of neglect and in times of oppression, beautiful things happen. Communities come together despite differences, and they are led by women, because women are, to me, the most resilient population on the planet. We live in a patriarchal society that is incredibly violent. However, it is built on the shoulders of people like the women here. And what gives me hope is that as much as they try to push us into corners of desperation and take away our resources, it is movements like that, and what we've seen in Iran, that women and individuals are no longer afraid. You can take everything away, but you can't take away our hope, our faith. And right now, you have people fighting in Iran and elsewhere in the world that aren't afraid to lose their lives anymore. As a child that comes from a family and a father and a grandfather that were tortured for years by the Shah secret police for being Muslim, not my father, my grandfather, tortured for years for being a Muslim supporter and for being supporters of democracy. And I don't mean Western influence democracy, I mean voting and democracy for the people of Iran, by the people of Iran. I have been lucky enough to have had these core morals instilled in me from a very young age. And I am proud to continue the tradition of my family and standing up against Shahs. And no, Shahs are not a good thing just because the West tells us they are. And certainly this dictatorship that has no value for women or human life and has no value for Iranian lives, and not just sees women as livestock, but certainly sees everyone in Iran as disposable, so they can continue amassing as much power as possible. But like I said, I have tremendous hope. I have tremendous hope for the people here. I have tremendous hope for my family who is still doing the work in Iran. I have tremendous hope in all the places I've been where there has been oppression. There have always been communities, beautiful communities fighting back. And it comes hyperdown to hyperlocalism and community building and the ability to communicate with one another. And when I think about looking back at dictatorships such as Italy and what was done to the women there, like Mussolini, they found ways to band together even when they were working out in rice fields and being tortured. They found ways to communicate with one another through music, through song, through underground communication. And look what they achieved. And we don't get to hear a lot about what happens outside of Western genocide and Western holocausts. But I assure you, that has been happening globally for a very long time. And although we are seeing bodily autonomy also stripped away in this country, and we see this country pushing the agenda of abstinence only around the globe, I have also seen midwives, doulas, especially Black women, and imparting on people thousands of years of knowledge on how to not depend on hospital systems that are looking to only victimize them, to not depend on USAID money that's being stripped away, to not depend on Western resources, but to instead find their own strengths from within themselves and being self-sufficient in their own communities. Do not let anyone tell you that your story does not matter. Do not let anyone tell you that your history does not matter, because every person in this room is a survivor of something. And the more we communicate with each other, and the more we share our subjective experiences, the more we will teach each other, and the more we will band together. But please do not for a second allow what we are seeing as a free fall into fascism in many places in this world. Do not for a second let them condition you to reduce anybody to a statistic or a number. Do not let them continue to take away the rights of women and young girls. And if there is anything we can do to the men in this room, to white individuals, to people that have the privilege of speaking up, please use your allyship and your platforms to speak on behalf of the stories you see here. Because many of these women were stolen from their families. Children were stolen from them. They have been beaten, gassed for speaking out. And I'm not talking just about older women, I'm talking about young girls as well. And rape is used as a form of torture, especially in Iran, because it's believed that virgins go to heaven, and if they take away your virginity, you will suffer forever from that point. The best way to arm yourselves is also through education. Continue talking to each other, because like I said, the women here have subjective experiences that I will never experience. And so talking to each other and sharing our stories with each other will educate one another. And for people who have the ability, a platform to impact local legislation and change, like being able to decriminalize abortion on a local level and starting a reproductive justice fund in the city of Atlanta, the first city to do that in the Southeast region, where we had the opportunity to be able to fly women out of our state to seek reproductive health care. Talk to us, because the experiences I've had as a sexual assault victim, as somebody who's lived in my car, as somebody who has had nothing, survival, and those of us who have been surviving are the most resourceful people on the planet. And it is important to expose yourself to different perspectives, because it will allow people to shape legislation that is more inclusive. Inclusivity is everything. And I'll end by saying that as much as you can, expose yourself to outside culture. Not to quote Mark Twain, travel is fatal to prejudice and bigotry and racism. Expose yourself to as much as you possibly can. Educate yourself on people's stories. Share your stories, because a story is the most intimate thing you could share with another person. Like I said, I have tremendous hope. I have tremendous hope for the people the leaders that we have here and the leaders that are being formed every single day. And like I said, you don't need anybody to gatekeep for you. You have all the tools you need to stand up and have a voice. You don't need to be asked to come speak at a forum like this. You don't need any of that. You have the ability to impact this change all on your own with community. And please don't ever let someone convince you that you don't have that right or that you don't have a story in your roots, because that is also a tool that is used against us again, so that history can repeat itself. But I am confident now more than ever that we are sharing our information from generation to generation, passing down stories, educating each other, and learning from our history and embracing our roots and our ancestry. And I can think of no better way to fight hate and violence. And as an Iranian American, I will never stop fighting for the women of Iran, who have shown us time and time again how resilient they are, who have taken to the streets under threat of being stripped from their families, under threat of having their bodies stolen from their graves and hidden from their families, because they made it clear that violence doesn't stop after death. But I know that Iranian people will prevail, and I know that there will be democratic elections by the people of Iran in our lifetime. And I know that one day I'll be able to return to the country that I'm from and finally get in touch with my roots and to see the world that my parents came from. And I thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you for being here. Thank you for leading in this country at a time where we need leadership. And thank you for connecting our story to the stories of the world. Sorry, Ida, we're trying. It's just such an intimate setting. I don't know what to say. We're trying. Poor Ida's been doing this
trying to get us to speak
the
up.
whole time. At this point, we have a few minutes. As you heard, they will be evacuating this building, but we do have till 8:10, so we have some time to clean up. But we have a few minutes for questions, comments, anything like that.
Or if you're so moved that you're silent, that's okay.
I did have one, yeah, but let's give a second. So the open question to all of you. I was thinking a little bit about how we've been talking about it a long time span for a lot of these events, and something that's really new and definitely the part of the conversation is what I really want to ask is, what do y'all feel is the relevance of the internet in this fight? And making people more aware.
It's had an explosive impact positively on stopping the silence in Iran, for example. In the most recent movements, like over the past 8 to 10 years, live footage of what's happening in the streets has been broadcast to the whole world because of digital technology, because of phones. That never happened before. It was a secret because journalism is so held back there. It was very hard for us to understand anything about what was going on, especially out in public streets. So since everybody is using some kind of an online platform, a social media platform, live videos are, you can't ignore the real thing happening in your face on your, when you see it on TV on your phone. So it's had a very big impact for people outside of these countries, but also people inside who are feeling that community, feeling that sense of, oh my God, the women in Tehran, there's 5,000 of them in the streets, and we feel the same way. And so the spreading of that sense of, it's the way I feel, it's okay to get out there and get on the streets. So it's that kind of spreading of it. It's made a huge difference.
Oh,
Huge difference.
So to also say, I think that the regime in Iran has been very good at painting different pictures of what has occurred. When they've had elections and there have been mass executions or other things, they've been really good at hijacking the narrative. So we saw a lot when the revolution, when Mahsa Amini was brutally murdered. There was obviously mass protests that erupted, and the regime attempted to frame a lot of the murders as suicides or other things. There was a young girl named Sheda, she was 15, and took to the streets. Her story probably breaks my heart more than most. And she was in the streets, brave as could be, left her house without telling her family, and was in the streets screaming at the mullahs and fighting back. And then the morality police came after her. She was hiding between cars. They ended up capturing her and taking her to one of the notorious jails that use rape as a form of torture and weaponization. And they tried to dress someone up that looked like her to make it seem like she climbed a building and was pushed off of it. Because of the media and because of the communication globally, the community was able to prove that falsehood and advocate for her life, and also was able to find out the attempts by the mullahs to actually steal her body from her family after. So, I mean, it's also allowed Iranian people to say what has happened and like what is going on and to give their own perspective, that access to technology, despite the attempts by the dictatorship to do media blackouts and everything else. And that is, obviously social media has several negative impacts. But in terms of connecting people around the globe, in terms of humanizing perspectives and allowing people a voice for the first time and allowing us to know who is in jail, who is being tortured, what is happening. These were many stories that were not accessible to us prior to this. So in that way, it has allowed us to learn just how brutal things have been and how to fight back.
I also think that it's given the younger generation a global identity that didn't exist before. We've always had boundaries, like country boundaries, borders, national boundaries, ethnic boundaries, etc., that have prevented us from being able to see one another as human. And I think when I talk to my nieces and nephews who are in their 20s now, I see this. They don't have those boundaries anymore. Those are not their borders anymore. They connect with other people in the world the same way they connect with someone in their neighborhood. And that is extremely powerful in terms of giving voice and attention to the issues around the world and to women who are otherwise isolated in corners of the world and have no access. So I think the younger generation's sort of cultural identity and seeing it from a global perspective has the momentum and the potential to change the whole dynamic that we're existing in today. So that's where my hope is. I tell my niece and nephew all the time, my hope is with you all, because they just don't see the boundaries the same that we do. Even my generation, I prided myself in not having those boundaries, but I'm 45 years old, I have those boundaries. And my upbringing has impacted me, but they don't have it the same way. They don't see the world the same way, and that gives me hope.
Technology transcends geographical boundaries.
Absolutely.
Thanks for the question.
Did you have a question?
First, thank you everyone here for sharing your experiences. This was such a powerful and really moving conversation, so thank you all very much. I'm one of just a couple of US staff that work for a local organization based in southwestern rural Kenya. We deal with challenges of female genital mutilation, child marriage, lack of education for girls, lack of healthcare for women, lack of any type of knowledge around reproductive rights. And when I say any type of knowledge around reproductive rights, I mean the fact that you could say no to female genital mutilation. The fact that, oh, by the way, it's actually illegal. Or do not rape. Rape is bad. That kind of level of a lot of misconceptions around menstruation, puberty, myths around what might happen. I'm wondering, I guess ultimately it comes down to a woman's sense of agency. And so I'm wondering, as we've talked about so many of the conversation is around women who are these great activists who are speaking up for other women around the world, I'm wondering how much, if anybody could comment on, in these type of environments, rural settings, kind of women's lack of agency, their lack of knowledge that they can say no.
So your question is about how we actually provide that education in rural areas?
Mm-hmm.
That's a really good question. When I was in Illoret, northern Kenya, yeah, so working with the Dasanich tribe up there, it was really interesting because I swear to God, every time I talk at this point, it feels homophobic. So, I think one of the most interesting things was when I was speaking to different generations of women, I was there for archaeological excavations, but did my own cultural field study with some of the Dasanich women that were there. And it was a society, deeply patriarchal, isolated during colonization for retaliating against put them in one of the most isolated regions on the planet. that, but they had plenty of guns. And women were forced to work in the field until like oftentimes their third trimester, collapsing and often dying as a result. And it was really interesting because I talked about that crossroads between Christian influence by German missionaries and the older traditions. And I got to interview the oldest woman in the tribe and and her daughter and her granddaughter. And she believed, the matriarch believed, that without female genital mutilation, without female circumcision, that she would die from uncleanliness. But then, and that section happened for the purpose of pleasure, it happens for the purpose of procreation only, which, as we know, that oftentimes if a husband dies in those communities, we have like things occur like sewing up vaginas and only allowing for a small hole for menstruation and other things, which often leads to severe infection. And that, I think, and it was very interesting because a lot of the young women that were doing that actually wanted to start having sex for pleasure because they'd experienced it. And out of any jobs they wanted to either be an officer or a teacher or a doctor. Those were the only 3 jobs they knew about. But I saw Doctors Without Borders and a bunch of agencies out there that were coming at it from a non-biased lens and without any type of religious influence to provide healthcare in those communities and to set up to educate women. But they had to do it carefully because the culture that existed there did not allow them to tell their husbands about it. And like even in parts of like rural India where I worked with young couples, like I got to work with some young couples here, and they were trying to force their children to have more children because the idea, I believe they said, if you have one son, it's like having only one eye. And I think the key to it, until it doesn't help that our country is also preaching global abstinence and refusing to do funding unless a lot of these countries do that, like what we saw with the Bush administration with Uganda. So I think some of the key ways to do that are to work with local nonprofits on the ground, not national. In fact, or international, because they have no understanding of local cultures oftentimes. And so I think it's important to try to work with local nonprofits and NGOs on the ground and to fund people who are directly on those grounds so we actually know where the money is going. And in terms of education, it's going to have, in my opinion, it has to be very adaptable and very mobile. And it has to be done until there's cultural shifts. It has to be done quietly so we don't endanger the women that are there. Because I have seen time and time again, women get beaten in front of me for speaking about wanting more. And so it is difficult to provide those resources when we have such a patriarchal culture. But I have seen that as very possible through like local community building. There are really good people on the ground doing this work, people like you. And the network and the ability that you have to connect people on the ground, because oftentimes it's small resources that actually make the biggest difference. The biggest thing you can do is people on the ground actually expressing what is needed and providing the resources. That's what I've seen to be the most successful.
With that, you have to cut us off. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for the work that you're doing in the communities that you're part of.